I also saw him at the International Convention in Seattle 5 years ago. He came to see me over in California once when I was there visiting a wonderful friend of mine who's no longer with us. He's been very important in my life, and I love his message, and I hope you will too. So, Bob?
Hi, my name is Bob Lahan. I'm a very grateful member of Al-Anon. And you brought back a lot of memories, Pat, that I had in the back of my head here that I had forgotten a little bit. But it's real nice to be here. It's nice to participate in an AA function, and I don't know whether you're aware of this, but I'm very much aware of it. Have you noticed that they have given the Al-Anon speaker 2 hours instead of 1? That all the AA speakers have 1 hour, but I've got 2? And you know the reason for that? We remember more. And sometimes it takes a little longer for us to go over our story. I always point out that my wife's story is primarily from a hearsay, from what I've told her she did, because she was a blackout drinker, But it's real nice to be here and seeing some old friends. Marna over here, we served as delegates 10 years ago, I don't think I've seen you since that time, and other people who are here that are friends of mine. So I really appreciate being here. I was last in New Orleans for the International in 1980, and something very interesting happened to me during that time. I was at a late meeting one night, a sharing type of a meeting, and a woman got up and she started talking about all the situations that she was experiencing in life and all of her problems when the chairperson of that meeting said, well, all stories are not success stories. And something made me raise my hand, and I said, I disagree. All stories are success stories. We just haven't read the last chapter. And I think this is really what's happening, at least for me and so many other people that I see in the programs of AA and Al-Anon, is that we're really writing our life story, and we haven't yet come to that last chapter. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that during the primary part of the story there's not a lot of trauma and a lot of things that maybe we would prefer not to go through, but at the end there's always that happy ending, even though it may not appear to be a happy ending. And I think that this is really important, at least for me, to always remember. When I came into Al-Anon, there was absolutely nothing left of our marriage. My wife and I had been married some 23 years at that time. There was absolutely nothing left. I hated her, I loathed her, I had no respect for her, and I'm sure that she felt the same way that I felt towards her. See, alcoholism had destroyed this marriage. I didn't realize it at that time. A number of years ago, I asked my wife, I said, did we ever sit down and say, let's see if we can work this thing out, let's see if we can work our marriage out? She said, no, that never happened. What happened is when we got on our programs, I was fortunate coming into Al-Anon before her sobriety, that we got on the program, started working our programs for ourselves, and a healing took place. A healing took place. And this is really what this program is all about, I believe, is a spiritual healing which some way or other comes into the physical, the mental, and the emotional. And a healing is taking place. And if we're lucky, if we can get through the next 2 weeks, we'll have 51 years of marriage. My wife says in Southern California that's considered a sin to be married that long, but it's been a good life. It's been an interesting life, and no longer are we dependent upon one another for our happiness. As a result of that, we can be happy through this program. A number of years ago, we had the privilege going up to Vancouver, British Columbia, to speak up there, and we made a vacation out of it. We took a week off and rented a car, traveled the islands up there, Vancouver Island, and beautiful thing, but had a fantastic time. And then came down to this 5-star hotel where they're having this convention, and Goldine was sitting out in the car, I went in and registered, and I was coming back out. I thought, what have I ever done to deserve this? And then I remember I used to say the same thing before sobriety. What did I ever do to deserve this, And I came to realize that we are deserving people. Nothing special, but we're deserving people. And this is all due to the program, to the principles, the spiritual principles of this program through the 12 steps, traditions, and concepts, which allows us, I believe, to tap in to this, what's called basic goodness of the universe. And it keeps flowing and flowing and flowing. Jolene was out in the car. I went out the car and I said, if it wasn't for you, we wouldn't be experiencing things like this. She says, well, I knew someday you'd appreciate me. Also, a number of years ago, that's a story in itself, but I walked away from a business. God made me give up a business. Now, that's someday I'll tell you about that one. But I had to get in touch with myself because I was scared financially and how I survive and et cetera, et cetera. I had to trust the program. That was the whole thing. I had to trust this God that I had found in this program because this was the feeling that I had inside of me that I should give up this business. My wife thought I was crazy. So what I did is I took a week or so off and I just went out camping to get in touch with myself. I didn't want to talk to anybody. I didn't want to see anybody. I was doing a lot of reading, a lot of meditating. And I ended up one night down in Tucson at a large park. And I didn't want to be near anybody, and I went clear to the back. And I was probably a quarter of a mile away from anybody, just to be by myself. And during the middle of the night, I heard a car drive up nearby. The next morning, I got out, went out and made myself some coffee, and I looked over at this car, and a man was sitting up in the back seat, and he had a bottle, and I thought, my God, I still attract alcoholics. That, I think, is important. What is there about me, or what was there about me that makes it necessary to have an alcoholic in my life? For me, I believe it took an alcoholic to teach me how to love the unlovable. I think this is really what it's all about. I happen to believe in the 12 steps. I happen to believe that that's the greatest thing that's ever been given to modern man. And I could go into a lot of examples of that. But within the 12 steps is only one promise that I see. And that's in the 12th step. And it's been pointed out. Having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. So one promise. Some way or other, if I work these steps or experiencing them, I will have this spiritual awakening. Had a woman one time said, Bob, I've been working the first 3 steps for the last 60 days and nothing's happening. I said, well, had you ever thought that there are 12 of them? A lot of people think there's only 3 steps, or the first and the 12th. There are 12 steps. And instead, if I work those steps or experience them, I'll have the spiritual awakening. That's the only thing that's promised in there. And I had trouble with that. What is this spiritual awakening I'm supposed to experience? And it was several years after I got into a step study meeting and started trying to understand these steps, that following some meditation one morning, it came to me so very, very clearly, just like that. And it was so simple, I almost missed it maybe. It's so simple that if you listen to me from head to head, you'll miss the whole thing, because I'm not talking head to head. I'm talking heart to heart. And the thought that came was that everything's okay. Just that simple. Now, everything okay does not mean that trauma is going to leave, chaotic situations are going to leave, so-called, quote, problems are going to happen. But to know that everything's okay. I remember a woman told me later, she was at the second Al-Anon meeting she'd ever been at, and she was sitting next to me, and I kept reassuring her, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. She had a violent alcoholic husband at home. I kept saying, it's okay, it's okay. She locked into that, it's okay, it's okay. She didn't know how to drive. She rode a bicycle to meetings. And she said that night she rode home on her bicycle, and every time her foot went down, she said, "It's okay, it's okay, it's okay." And she opened the door, and her husband was passed out on the Davenport. She said, "It's not okay." She said it took her 3 years to realize that it was okay. You see, there was no violence that night. And this becomes our problem. We put definition as to what okay is in our terms rather than the terms of reality out there. You see, it was okay because there was no violence that night. And this is what I see in Al-Anon. I happened to go to a step study meeting. I'm a member of the Monday night Riverside 12-step study meeting where we study the steps and the traditions. I find a lot of people don't like the steps. I was going for many, many years to a discussion group where they talk about problems. And you don't have them down here, I'm sure. Where they walk in and say, "Does anybody have a problem?" And then everybody starts digging the mud hole, trying to get down deeper than the person next to them, you know. But this step study meeting was probably about the third of the size of this open discussion meeting where they talked about problems. And it made me realize, a lot of people don't want to get well. They want to talk about their problems, If they wanted to get well, it would seem that the step study meeting would be 3 times as big as the discussion meeting, But I go to that's probably the best meeting in the world, and somebody pointed out that if your meeting isn't the best one in the world, don't go to another one and screw that one up too, But I had an experience, I think it was over at Lafayette or Baton Rouge, I don't know which one. But a woman wanted to talk to me about her problems. And I said, "Well, let's have breakfast tomorrow morning." So we met for breakfast. And I was giving my full attention to her problems. Now, if you are talking to people who have problems, you give 100% attention, they get really excited about it. And she got excited about the problems. And then she started projecting these situations. In 6 months, this might happen. And then she went and said, 9 months, this might happen. Finally, she just blurted out. And as she was sitting there, she had her elbow on the table holding this piece of toast. And she said, "Bob, what should I do?" And with no hesitation, I said, "Why don't you eat your toast?" Now, these were words that came out of my mouth. They were not my thoughts. But I've learned so much from that incident because at any given moment, there are certain things that we need to do and have to do and that life has brought to us to do at any particular incident. But I have found this, that a problem is always in the future, never now. I was up in Omaha, Jill's not here, I don't know, but I told that story one time, said everybody's going around saying, "Eat your toast, eat your toast, eat your toast." But this is it. You see, problems are always in the future. Now, it doesn't mean that everything's going to be okay. I mean, that everything is not traumatic at the time. But in looking back at my life through all of this trauma, I can see the okayness of it. That everything is okay. I had to go through certain experiences. Life is constructive, fair, hurts at times. I've discovered that pain is never fatal. It just hurts like hell at times, I've learned from pain. I learned from my pain. I learned from your pain. I prefer to learn from your pain than my pain. So I'm a willing student now of what these 12 steps are. But I find the strength in the program, the 12-step program, the traditions, and the concepts here. So this is why I keep coming back. I was at a meeting one time in Santa Monica, and I got there a little bit early, and I was talking to the secretary. And she was talking about how she was going to leave Al-Anon because she'd been in Al-Anon about 3 or 4 years and had reached all of her goals. She had been the secretary, she had been the group representative, she'd even found a husband in Al-Anon, so she'd reached all of her goals. And she said, "Bob, how long have you been coming?" At that time it was about 25 years, if I remember. And she said, "What are your goals?" I said, "I don't have any goals." She said, "If I had a goal and I reached the goal, I wouldn't have to come back anymore, would I?" So I just keep showing up. And as the other speakers have mentioned, just by keep showing up, it's fantastic what occurs in my life, Now, it wasn't always like that. It was Alcoholism was a slowly developing thing that destroyed everything in our life, except that I didn't realize it until I came to Al-Anon. I'm sure my wife didn't realize it until she came into Alcoholics Anonymous. But I was going through Navy flight training, and I had met Goldine at a small college up in Nebraska where she was going to school, and about a year later she came down to Corpus Christi, Texas, where I was going through some advanced training then, to visit. And, Navy cadets were not supposed to be married. You couldn't get into the program being married, and if you were married before you were commissioned, it was automatic washout. But we were having a party one night with another couple who on the sly had gotten married. And this was a bottle of gin that we had. And they thought maybe it'd be a good idea if Goldine and I got married. And we thought it was a pretty good idea, too. Well, this other woman worked for a judge down there in Corpus Christi, Texas. She called this judge on Saturday night, said we wanted to get married, and the judge said that he'd go down to the courthouse, make arrangements to get a license, find a minister, and we got married the next morning, Sunday. I had I think it was every 8th day off at that time. I had to go back to base that night. Goldine went to an apartment that she'd got. And the reason I tell that story is I want to tell you about the power of sex and alcohol. You put those two things together, and anything can happen. And Goldine, this is what Goldine used to say, when she drank, everything seemed like a good idea. But this was how our marriage started, and it should never have succeeded. Because every 8th day, we would do the same thing. We'd buy a bottle, we'd go out to a honky-tonk, dance, have a lot of fun, and this was life. And alcohol then became a very, very important part of our life. She became dependent upon it. I'm sure at the point that she crossed over this invisible line from social drinking to alcoholic drinking, that I also pass over into an invisible line called Al-Anonism. I describe that as the neurotic compulsion to stop the drinking of a person who has a neurotic compulsion to drink. And I became an Al-Anonic at that time. This is not a term we use, but I think this is true. But really what happened is that alcohol in her gave her the power not to have to mind me. You see, we would go out and she wouldn't be ladylike at times. And I would have to verbally caution her about this and straighten her up, As time went on, I would use my elbow, my Al-Anon elbow, to get her attention, straighten up. And at times I'd pinch her. And as time went on, I hit her a couple of times. This was all for her benefit, to straighten her up, And alcohol in her gave her enough courage not to mind me. Now, I always did this hitting on the sly. And I didn't, until I took an inventory in Al-Anon, I didn't realize that. I stayed in this marriage not because I was a noble person, but because I was a coward. And I'd like to explain that. There might be other cowards here in this room, I don't know. But I came from a broken home. And when I was a young teenager, my parents separated and ultimately divorced. And divorce was not fashionable in those days. The family was divorced, kind of looked down at it those times. And I remember I had been around church activities and youth groups and things like that, where they were talking about this God bit, which didn't make any sense to me. I was there primarily for the social actions. But when my parents separated, I remember praying to a God I didn't trust, believe in, or know anything about, that our family would get back together, and this family never got back together. I knew then that God played favorites, and I wasn't one of them. And this kind of turned me off. But another more insidious thing happened, which I was not aware of until I took an inventory. And some way or other, I programmed myself into saying I was not going to have a marriage like my parents. So as far as I know, before I came to Al-Anon, I never complained about my wife to another human being. Because to do so, they would know that ours was not this perfect marriage. And I would wear this face and this big smile, and I'd be the perfect gentleman out in the crowd. But boy, I'd get get her off by myself, and I'd really light into her. And it wasn't until Al-Anon that I was able to really complain about her to other people, you know. But Al-Anon, alcoholism was kind of slowly developing over the period of years, and we were living in Long Beach at the time where it came to its head. We used to do a lot of drinking there, and on a Friday night we'd kind of relax and go up to a little honky-tonk up in the corner, or a steakhouse and bar, and we'd always end up in the bar. Bars out there in California closed at 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock, we would be fighting, and the bartender would say, "It's time to go home." And the next morning, I looked in the billfold, and a large part of the paycheck was gone. And one time I said, Goldine, I said, we're not going to do that anymore because you're always getting so much trouble. And Goldine said, "Well, let's go up there and have one drink, eat dinner, and come home." And that sounded reasonable, you know. So we went up there and had a vodka martini, and then they brought the Roquefort salad, and I was watching her. It was all over her face and all over her blouse and all over the table. I thought, how on one martini could she get like that, you know? Then after dinner, she said, "Let's have one after-dinner drink." Well, at 2 o'clock in the morning, we were fighting, and the bartender was telling us that it was time to go home, and I thought, next morning, I thought, how did that happen? And it was about that time I found a hidden bottle. It had never occurred to me that she'd been drinking all the time, getting ready to go out to dinner, you know. And this infuriated me. And I remember taking that bottle, sitting up on the kitchen counter, and I started asking Al-Anon questions. Why do you do it? And I got alcoholic answers. I don't know. And I'd say, "You do too know." And she'd say, "I don't know." And this would lead us into meaningful discussions. You know. Both of us usually had to get the last word in, so you know where that would end. And if I couldn't win this argument, at times I'd say, "If you're going to be like that, then get out. Get out." And she'd get in the car, drive around the block, come back, promise not to do those things anymore, and we'd kiss and make up, live happily ever after, and next month, get out, get out. And of course, if she was gone too long, I'd get in the other car to go try to find her. The other extreme was at times I would punish her. I wouldn't speak to her. And we could go days on end, not speaking to one another. And she sometimes says those are the happiest days of her life, you know. But this was alcoholism developing in our family, and we didn't really recognize it, you know. But one of the things that I used to think that alcoholism caused my anger, and I now realize it was merely the catalyst that brought it out. I had always been an angry person due to my own insecurity. I have come to realize that anger is due to the feeling of being threatened, due to lack of self-worth. And I didn't understand or realize I lacked self-worth until I came into the Al-Anon program. You see, I was an achiever. I was very arrogant, very self-righteous, which I thought was self-confidence, and it was not. I'd set goals, I'd reach goals, hoping that that would give me self-worth, and it never did. Outside achievement never gave me self-worth except for a short moment of time, you know. But the real self-worth has come from this program, from the inside here. And as a result of that, anger generally has left me. I always say I have refresher courses once in a while to keep me honest, but generally because of a feeling of self-worth that has come as a result of this program. This, I think, is our common denominator. People in any 12-step program lacks self-worth. But one might look at me and say, "Gee, you got a lot of confidence." I did not have confidence. That was all a show out there. That was all a show. But the alcoholism slowly progressed. And we used to have a next-door neighbor and his wife. We did a lot of partying on Saturday nights, and I'd buy a bottle, and half of it was left, and I said, "Let's save this for next Saturday." And Goldine and him always had to finish that bottle. I couldn't understand it. But one nice thing about the Al-Anon program is it has taught me I don't have to understand anything. Al-Anon is not a program of understanding. Al-Anon to me is a program of acceptance. You see, you can read all of the Al-Anon literature and all the books on alcoholism, listen to all the speakers and the tapes and et cetera, and nothing will change in your life. We just get smarter if we're asked to answer some questions about alcoholism in some test. But nothing will change. And the program of Al-Anon for me is a program of acceptance. Let me read that and do it, then I will know that I know rather than think that I know. So the Al-Anon program is a program of acceptance. While living in Long Beach, Goldane had some trouble with the drinking, and this fellow next door had gotten on the AA program, and Goldane thought that maybe she should go to AA. One time she said she had a drinking problem. My answer, don't drink so much, obviously. You see, I used to drink a lot myself. I didn't have the allergy, you see. I didn't understand why she had to drink so much, because I could stop in the middle of a drink. To this date, after almost 29 years in the program, I still do not understand why an alcoholic drinks when they know that they're an alcoholic. I can't understand that, you see. But my wife understands it completely, and any other alcoholic understands it. But I, not being an alcoholic, I can't understand it, you see. But like I say, Al-Anon does not make it necessary for me to understand it. I have to accept it here. But this fellow got on the AA program, and Goldine thought that she should maybe go to Alcoholics Anonymous, and I was totally against it. I didn't know anything about AA, obviously. I didn't know anything about alcoholism, but I remember saying, I'm not going to let her be an alcoholic. I'm not going to let her be an alcoholic, not even knowing what an alcoholic was, you know. But anyway, she went to, Frank has been a friend of mine for over 40 years. But he wasn't that good a friend where he could be taking my wife out at night, you know. And so I had no use for AA. And Goldine went for 30, 60 days. She stopped her drinking. And then from her story, she says she found out that AA was talking about no drinking at all. She was trying to find a way to control her drinking, and so she went back to her drinking. And at that point, then things really started collapsing in our household. We had 3 children, all of them affected by alcoholism. We had all kinds of fights and arguments and anger expressions, and you know, I was mad at everything. I was mad at her. I was mad at the kids. I was mad at my job. I was mad at the people I was meeting out in the work world, and I was just angry at everything. I was walking out the door just angry. And I could be sitting in an interview with some people and not paying any attention to what I was trying to do, but thinking about, remember last night, remember last week, or where's she at now, what's it going to be like tonight, and all of that stuff, you know. And this is the disease of Al-Anonism, the mental obsession of somebody else's behavior. My obsession with her was as great as the obsession of any alcoholic for alcohol. And I think that this is only the difference between Al-Anon and AA, is that in AA the obsession is a liquid, and in Al-Anon the obsession has 2 feet. It's the only difference. And I could be driving down the freeway, not paying attention to my driving, you know, but again thinking about her, you know. And it was driving me crazy. I was about ready to give up a job I'd been at for about 10 years. I was working for a 2-man partnership. I was the 3rd man there, and I just wanted out. I didn't know what I wanted to do, didn't know where I wanted to go or anything, but I just wanted out. And I was about ready to quit that job. And one of the partners found out about it, and he said, where do you want to go? And I knew a fellow out in Riverside, a corresponding type of a business, and I said Riverside. He said, well, we'll open up an office there. And I still don't understand why this man did that, but it's part of my life. Some way or other it was necessary to get to Riverside. But something very important happened. We had about 3 or 4 months advance notice before moving to Riverside. And Goldine said, get off my back, leave me alone. When we get to Riverside, I'll stop the drinking. And to this date, I don't remember too much about what happened during those 3 or 4 months. I remember everything else. But we got out to Riverside. A short time later, she started drinking again, and nothing happened except new hiding places. But the important thing for me that came out of that incident when I was in Al-Anon and reflecting back on it is, why do we believe the promise of the alcoholic? I'm sure the alcoholic wants to keep the promise when they make the promise, but due to the nature of the illness, they cannot. But why do we in Al-Anon believe the promise of the alcoholic? Well, for me, I had nothing else to believe in for my happiness. We have to believe in something for our happiness. I don't care what it is. For the alcoholic, obviously, it's alcohol. Some people, money, sex, house up on the hill, prestige, offices, etc., etc. But we have to believe in something for our happiness, and regardless of how often it fails us, we will go back to it. And I had no spiritual belief in anything, and the basis for my happiness was a successful marriage, so I always had to go back and believe her. Always. And it wasn't until I came into Al-Anon that I found some spirituality that I could then transcend my belief that she was going to make me happy, and something else was going to make me happy. But I was a bottle hunter. I don't know whether there are any other bottle hunters here. She was a pretty good bottle hider, by the way. We played a lot of games of hide and go seek, and I would, like I said, bring the bottle out and ask her these questions, and I wasn't getting apparently the proper response. So what I do is I find the bottle, put a little mark there, come home at night, put another mark. So I could tell. I thought that was my responsibility as a husband, know how much he was drinking. Any other bottle markers in the room? You missed the whole game. My God, But we were out in Riverside and built an office under the home to cut down expenses, because I had bought out the interest of that business after about a year. And one time Goldine said, well, the reason that she drank is that she had never had any responsibility. She's always been a housewife. So thought that was a good idea, so gave her some responsibility, put her on as a secretary. And all we got out of that was a drunken secretary. Instead of a drunken housewife, she was a drunken secretary. And she talked about how sick I was. I kept her for a year. But I was out of the office most of the time, and I'd come home at night, and there she was sleeping in the chair. I didn't even realize she was passed out. She started going back to Alcoholics Anonymous, couldn't stay sober, and after a while I realized that maybe she needed a little help and support in that. So I started going to AA speaker meetings with her. And I could really identify between that speaker and her. And whenever there was a point of identification, I'd give her the old Al-Anon nudge, pay attention to this. And on the way home, I'd go through that speaker's talk, all these important points that she should remember. She'd sit in the corner of the car giving me this go-to-hell type of a look, and the next day she'd be drunk, and I couldn't understand that, We have other things happening with our children. We had a 16-year-old daughter who wasn't minding me, and I put pressure on her. And one night I said, Barb, you either start minding me, or you have to get out of the house. And she started packing a little grip. She walked out of the house. I knew that she would be back because she needed me to look after her, and she didn't come back. And I thought, well, I better go find her, put some sense into her. And I went looking for her, and I found her in a phone book down by the freeway. She'd been making some telephone calls, and I went up to her and I said, Barb, you start minding me, you come home. And she looked me right square in the eye and said, Dad, I'm not coming home. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say. One of the bad things about self-righteousness for me is I could never take any responsibility for what was taking place. See, self-righteousness always caused me to look outside as the cause. And I didn't know what to... I didn't have the courage to say I'm sorry. I didn't even know that I was sorry. And I left her there in that phone book, and I still remember the feeling I have down here of driving home, that everything in our life For some 22, 23 years of marriage was going down the rat hole. Goldine was drunk all the time, the daughter running away. I like to talk about Barb a little bit because she ran away. I went down to San Pedro, California, stayed with some friends, graduated from high school. By that time, I was in the program. I made verbal amends to her by then. Permanent amends, by the way, that never occurred until I became an Alateen sponsor years later, not with my daughter there, but the ability to give back to teenagers as a group. Those are my amends. This is how the guilt was removed from me, ultimately, regarding my daughter. But anyway, after high school, she married a young man who drank a little bit. And we used to talk to her about going to Al-Anon. Go to Al-Anon. No, I don't need Al-Anon. I don't need Al-Anon. But after about 10 years, some violence started in the house. And one time she called and said, Dad, can I come home to live? And I was far enough into the program to realize what she was doing. And I said, I'm sorry, Barb, you can come home for a visit, but you can't come home to live. And that took courage on my part to say that, because I recognized that she was trying to run once more from alcoholism. I do not believe we can run from alcoholism. We have to transcend it and work through it, and this is what this program is all about. But as a result of my refusal, she started going to Al-Anon, and she got her self-worth, she got her spiritual values. See, she ran away from alcoholism. She had no Alateen. She had no belief in a God or a higher power. She had absolutely no self-worth. So she ran. And I don't think that we can run. This has taught me something very, very important. We cannot run from situations that come into our life, because we're going to run into them right around the corner. But the marriage didn't last for Barb, and that's okay, you see. But she didn't run from it. She went to something, you see. And to this day, she's got a lot of self-confidence, got a lot of poise, personal belief, and things like that, you know. There was one incident that I found out what Goldine had done, and my ego was hurt. I always maintained that I've never been hurt in life at all, but my ego has taken a tremendous beating, you know. But she did something that hurt the male ego, and she was passed out in the bed, and I was standing over her trying to figure out what should I do. Should I kill her, kill myself, or kill both of us? And there's an incident out in California right now that I identify with completely, you know. But I was just angry, just in a fury there. But for me, I've discovered this, that when I have crazy thoughts, something puts a crazier thought in my mind to keep me from doing it. And the reason I didn't do anything that night is, what would the neighbors think? They would know that ours was not a successful marriage, you know. And about a month later, something similar happened, and this time I told her to get out of the house. Get out. And she went down to Long Beach to stay with these former next-door neighbors, and they gave her 24 hours of AA through taped meetings and people walking through the house, and I was left at home with two small boys trying to be the mother and the father and the dishwasher and the lunch packer, feeling absolutely miserable, but enjoying it. That's called being a martyr and self-pity. It's a very, very deadly combination, by the way. But after about a week, Virginia from Long Beach called and said, Bob, why don't you come down and see if you can reconcile? And I went down, and I walked in. There's a little pamphlet they wrote about me. Some of us are arrogant, smug, self-righteous, domineering, and that's the way I walked in there. I said, if you do this, 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 you can come home. And she was pretty well beat. She agreed to everything. But that night, Virginia said, Bob, had you ever thought of Al-Anon? I had never heard the word consciously. But undoubtedly, the word must have been mentioned in some of those AA meetings. But the point is that we hear what we need to hear when we need to hear it, and not before. But I thought Al-Anon was some method to keep my wife sober. And I agreed to go to a meeting. And I went to a beginner's meeting. Walked in there were all ladies, not a man there. And this is my life in Al-Anon. And I could look at them and see that they certainly weren't having problems like me, because some of them were smiling, some had sparkles in their eyes. And then somebody said that I could not stop my wife from drinking. And that totally turned me off. I didn't want to have anything to do with it. I had, Al-Anon's not it, apparently. But on the way home, Virginia said, Bob, before you make up your mind on Al-Anon, why don't you try at least 6 meetings? And I said I would. I'd made a commitment. Now, I was a people pleaser. What would Virginia think of me if I didn't go to 6 meetings? So I had to go to 6 meetings. Goldina was never going to take another drop of liquor. And she started drinking again. But I started going to Al-Anon. And things started changing within me and apparently on the outside, too. The second meeting I was at, I met the first man in Al-Anon. He apparently had not been around a little while, and they were welcoming him back, and I got there a little bit early. I was listening to the conversation, and I heard one lady ask him and said, and how is your wife? And he says, she hasn't had a drink for 6 months. And I thought, well, what's he doing here? If his wife isn't drinking, why is he here? And then he said the strangest thing. He said that people at work were bugging him. He had to come back to find some serenity. I thought, what the devil's he talking about? And this is my life in Al-Anon. I hear strange things said by people with smiles in their face and sparkles in their eyes that make absolutely no sense to me. And I think about it, and after a while I have what's called the aha experience. Oh, I get it. I don't think you've ever had the aha experience. Go back and read your literature again. You'll see it's been revised since the last time you read it. Brand new thoughts in there each time I read it. I happen to be an outliner or an underliner. And I go back and I read something and I say, why did I underline that one when this next sentence is much more important? And the first thing you know, the whole book is underlined. And this is called the aha experience. One of the great aha experiences I had was I was probably in Al-Anon maybe 6, 7, 8 years at a step study meeting. We'd come around to the third step. My question always was, how do I turn my life and will over to the care of God? And I could never get an answer. How do I do it? What's the technique? And one day I saw a brand new word that had not been in that step before. The word decision. The third step only asks me to make a decision. It doesn't say for me to turn my life and will over to the care of God. All I have to do is make the decision to allow it to occur, and it's God's responsibility to show me how it is done. That changed my life. I now know, for me, that is the only step I take once, but I reaffirm it on a daily basis. The way I turn my life and will over the care of God is through the 11th step. But the decision had to come from that third step. And this was a great whammy aha experience. It changed my life. But another thing that occurred is that I would go to a meeting and I came to realize I felt better. And the next day seemed to be better. That something was taking place and I didn't really know what it was. And I still go to meetings and I still have that experience. Something takes place. Don't know, I can't, I have some ideas of what's involved, but I really don't know other than it occurs, But I was around Al-Anon about 6 weeks, and I use that word deliberately. I think we can be around Al-Anon or in Al-Anon, and there's a big difference. If we're in Al-Anon, things will change. If we are around Al-Anon, things may or may not change. But I was around Al-Anon about 6 weeks when I was feeling absolutely miserable. And the way I like to put it is when you're miserable, don't know you're miserable, you're not nearly as miserable as when you're miserable and you know you're miserable. But what happened is Al-Anon had made me aware of my feelings, and I was feeling absolutely miserable. And this is what I still do with newcomers. I make them aware how miserable they are. People say, oh, I feel awful. I say, good. No, you don't understand. Yeah, I understand. Good. Become aware of how miserable that you're feeling, because it's an answer to it. But if I'm going to go there and pacify them, that's not going to do any good at all. So I make people aware of how miserable they're feeling. They don't like it, but like an incident a couple of months ago, a woman called me one morning complaining about her husband, what he had done over the weekend. I said, gee, isn't it nice that you're married to him? Because if it wasn't for him, you wouldn't realize you still have anger and intolerance and stuff like that, you know. But I was very angry, and I became angry at Al-Anon for making me miserable. And I had to get even. So I went to an Al-Anon meeting. I don't think I'd ever been there before, to tell them off what they could do with this program. And I was over in San Bernardino on a Thursday night. And I went over there and I ranted and I raved about this Al-Anon program, what they could do with it. And they just sat there and they smiled at me. And when I ran down, a woman looked me right square in the eye and she said, Bob, you know now. And you have a choice. You can be miserable or you can work this program. And I didn't like that at all. And I would like to repeat that. You have a choice. You can be miserable or you can work this program. I believe that is when I took the third step, when I no longer wanted to be miserable. Now, nothing happened dramatically overnight, except I became teachable. I started getting over what's called ego sclerosis. I started to listen instead of argue. I started to pay attention to what was suggested. Nothing dramatic happened overnight, but that's been my journey ever since that night. I'm so grateful for that woman who came down from Seattle, Washington, to 2 meetings to change my life. And if she were sitting in this room, I wouldn't recognize her. And that's what this program is all about. We hear certain things that transforms us, and that was one of them. The first defect of character, I came into Al-Anon with only one defect of character, an alcoholic wife. But it was surprising how many defects Al-Anon gave me in a short period of time. When I broke through self-righteousness. And the first defect I recognized was that of anger. See, all my anger was always justified. But I started looking at that, and what would happen is I would get angry, and after I was angry, I would, or during the anger, I would, most of it was verbal, not very much physical in my reaction. And I would always say, damn it, Bob, why don't you learn to control your temper? But I could not control my temper because I was not aware at that time of my anger. But I watched people in the program talk about, they turn this over to God, they pray here, and et cetera, and it didn't make any sense to me at that time. But I remember one morning I got up and I said, God, don't let me be angry today. And at the end of I said this to a God I didn't believe in or know anything about. I just said, God, don't let me be angry today. And at the end of that day, I looked back, I had not been angry. And it was a miracle in my life. And I did that for a whole week, and for a whole week I was not angry. I didn't know what was occurring, but something was occurring. I didn't know what it was. That was about 28 and a half years ago. And since that time, I am always now made aware of when I am becoming angry. Now I have a choice. Now I have a choice. When I become aware that I am getting angry, I have a choice. I have 3 choices. I believe the psychologists say we have 2. Hold it in, let it out. Al-Anon has taught me a 3rd choice, and that is to learn to love the thing that you're angry at. And the example I always use involves a member of Alcoholics Anonymous who I detested. I didn't mind telling him how I felt about him, and he didn't mind telling me how he felt about me. So we always had good conversations, you know. But whenever I thought about John, I get this knot in my stomach. And one time I wanted to get a doll and put pins on it and call it John. He had had a heart attack. I wished to pray. I would pray that he had something a little bit more severe. I just didn't care for John. And one time a person said, "Why don't you pray for John?" I said, "Why should I pray for John?" He said, "Do you like the knot in your stomach?" I said, "No, I don't like the knot in my stomach." He said, "Well, you better pray for him." I said, "I'll be damned if I will." But finally the knot became more unbearable than praying for John. I started saying, "God bless that son of a bitch. God bless that son of a bitch." And after a while, the SOB dropped away, and I could sincerely say, "God bless him, God bless him, God bless him." And John started to change. I went up to John one time, and I said, "John, I sure have to pray a lot for you." And he says, "Bob, I have to pray a lot for you, too." What was occurring is that we were making amends. And the Al-Anon program in its preamble talks about a change of our attitude with spiritual help. And that's all that we did, is we had asked God to change our attitude. Now, to me, and also, I don't know if this ever happens to you, but have you ever noticed that when you need to make amends with somebody, that face is right in front of you all the time? And once you make the amend, the person disappears? Well, shortly after that incident, John moved up to Northern California. And I didn't see him too often, except occasionally at conventions. And whenever I saw him, I'd go up, put my arm around him, and say, "John, I love you." He said, "Bob, I love you too." He may still be an SOB to a lot of other people, but not to me. And that's the important thing. I imagine most people here in Al-Anon have that one day at a time board. I was reading that one time, and on October 4, down at the bottom, I read the biggest lie I had ever seen in print. And I was going to write WSO office telling them to get rid of that lie. And then I looked at that and I realized it was the most profound statement I have ever read on human relations. It says this, that if I work the 4th through the 10th step, the change in me will be reflected in every person who crosses my path. Now, if I interpret that right, it means that when I change, you change. And let me give you an example. I look out there and I see a lot of beauty, a lot of beautiful people. Who creates your beauty? I do. It's my perception of you that creates your beauty for me, just like your perception of the person sitting next to you or across the table from you or the driver in the car in the lane next to you. It is your perception of that person that creates your beauty or hatred or unbeauty. And this is really what that program today is, tolerance, is that what that is? Love and tolerance, huh? If I practice love and tolerance, I bring beauty into my life. 100 years ago, a man said, love is the essence, beauty is the manifestation. Love is the force, beauty is the result. And for me, I prefer to see the beauty of life rather than the ugliness of life, you see. And it's my choice, not your choice, you see. And that was a big jump for me. First of all, in what had occurred, but also to realize that there's a powerful force in these steps to get rid of defects of character. And I've been trying to work on them ever since that time. I said that wrong. I do not try to work on my defects. I humbly ask God to remove my defects to the 7th step. So something was occurring, and things started changing. Now, there were 2 incidences regarding Goldine's drinking that are important. I learned the steps. I memorized the steps. And I could talk to a newcomer, explain to them how they're powerless over alcohol. You can't stop that person from drinking. And then I'd leave the meeting. I'd think, I wonder if Goldine's been drinking. I wonder how much she's been drinking. I'd go home, get down on my hands and knees, find the bottle, put another mark there. All the time thinking I was working the Al-Anon program. But for my program, I found this to be true. That I do not work the steps until God, first of all, puts an experience in my life to experience the step. And what happened, we had a place down in Ensenada, Mexico that I used to go to, and there was a lot of drinking down there. Goldine had not had anything to drink for several weeks. She was trying to stay sober, couldn't do it very well. But she didn't have anything to drink for a couple of weeks. And we went down to Mexico and went over to some friend's house, and the first thing they did was pour out a drink for her and a drink for me. And that drink of hers was that far away. And up to that time, I would have picked it up and said, I'm sorry, she's not drinking, thank you. Or maybe I would have drank it myself, but I would have protected her from that alcohol. And I was not thinking about Al-Anon. I was not thinking about that first step, except something made me aware that whether or not she drank, that was her choice and not mine. And I sat back to see what took place. Almost like a spectator. I was not rooting for her. I was not rooting for the drink. What's going to happen? I was an observer, not a spectator. I mean, not a participant. What's going to happen? And I watched her struggle. And finally, she reached over, she picked that drink up, and she drank it. And at that instant, something started down at the bottom of my stomach, went out the top of my head. I didn't know what that was for a couple of months, or maybe a month. And I realized That was when I took the first step, or the first step was given to me, because from that time until now, I never tried to stop her from taking another drink. I was free of my obsession. I've come to understand that that's what we call detachment, or in California we call release. That I had backed off physically, emotionally, and mentally. I was not involved in any manner in that situation. I was letting this situation evolve. I was merely a spectator, which allows then, for me, in my understanding, a spiritual energy to come into a situation to clean it up. And what happened, the cleaning up was that I was relieved of my obsession to try to stop her from drinking. I was free. By that time, Goldine was drinking the fifth of vodka a day and all the wine that she could handle. The bottle came out at times. One day I walked in, and there she was at the kitchen counter drinking the bottle of vodka. I thought if she wants to drink herself to death, that's her choice, you see. By that time, we lost all communication. I might say good morning to her in the morning, and that's the start of an argument. I was going to a lot of meetings. Al-Anon taught me it takes two to have an argument. If I keep my mouth shut, there won't be an argument. It draws a lot of blood when you're biting down your lips, but no argument. One night, Goldine wanted to have an argument. And an alcoholic knows intuitively all the buttons to push to get the reaction. And Al-Anon told me to keep my mouth shut, and I was trying to read an Al-Anon book, and she was yak, 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 pushing all these buttons, and boy, I wanted to backhand her or slap her, but the little voice said, read your book, read your book, read your book. And after a while, she left, and she went down to the bedroom. And pretty soon she came back out. And as she went by me, she says, at least I'm going to die beautiful. Now there she was in a negligee. She walked past me into the kitchen. And she went to the medicine cabinet. I heard her fumbling around. I thought, oh my God, she's going to take some pills, she's going to kill herself. The little voice said, read your book, read your book, read your book. And these thoughts were going brrrr. And pretty soon she walked back down to the kitchen, down to the bedroom. And these thoughts were, my God, she's dying, she's killing herself, and et cetera, and et cetera. And thousand thoughts were going through. And finally, one thought came and lodged. And it said, this thought was that people are put in particular places to save human lives. It just occurred to me, I was involved at that point with principle and not personality. A human life was at stake. Not my wife's life, a human life was at stake. And I remembered an old home remedy. And I got up and I got a glass of water and a bar of soap, and I soaped up this glass real well. I got a bucket. I went down to the bedroom. She was passed out. I propped her up, poured this glass of soapy water down her throat, put my two fingers in her throat, her head in the bucket. Every time my fingers came out, she said, Bob, Bob, I didn't take anything, I didn't take anything. And that was the last time she ever threatened suicide. To alcoholics who still plan to go out to drink, I want to tell you, that's not in our literature, so you don't have to worry about that. But I was going to Al-Anon meetings, and I was going to a lot of Al-Anon meetings. And one night I was complaining about my drunken secretary at a meeting. And a wise Al-Anon said, if she was other than your wife, would you keep her? I said, of course not. The end of conversation. But not the end of the thought. The point is, if she had been somebody other than my wife, I would have fired her in a minute, because she was drunk on the job all the time, But the point is, why do we treat relatives differently than people? I gave a lot of thought to this. I said, I could live in this situation, going to a lot of meetings, but there's more to life than what I'm experiencing. So I made one of the major decisions of my life. And one time I sat her down. I said, I don't care what you drink, but not in this house. If you're going to drink, you're going to have to get out. And with that, I fired her. And I went about my business. And several days went by before I realized that she had stopped her drinking. And she'll have 29 years this coming September. What happens spiritually? This is a spiritual program. It's not a psychological program. It's not a behavior modification program. It's not a, if I do this and I expect that. This is a spiritual program. What happened? The words I used were pretty much the same I'd used many times before, except this time my motive was different. I was not in any manner trying to stop her drinking. You know, I had two boys in the house here. I don't want drinking going on in the house. If you're going to drink, get up. Years later, she said, you know, Bob, that was half my house you were going to kick me out of. I said, yeah, but God wouldn't let you know at the time, would he? But the important thing is this. I had swallowed my false pride and became willing to let the relatives, friends, and neighbors know ours was not a successful marriage. And probably something more important that occurred is that no longer was she the basis of my happiness. My real understanding didn't come for a couple of years. I read the Bible for the first time from cover to cover, and I ran across the story of Abraham and his oldest son, where God said to Abraham, you know, the oldest son was the apple of his eye, the basis of his happiness. God said, sacrifice your oldest son for me. Abraham became willing to do so, and as a result of his willingness to do so, he didn't have to do so. And so that's the key. I had become willing to give up the marriage and put that in a different priority. Now, from that, I've concluded this. The basis of my happiness is not a successful marriage. The basis of my happiness is my relationship with God. That's the only dependable thing I can ever find in life. Now, how do I maintain that? Through the Al-Anon program and the 12 steps. I feel for me that any and all defects of character for me are my inability to love myself, you, life. And we put it in these terms: guilt, resentment, self-pity, depression. All acts of non-love. And I can get emotionally comfortable by bringing in the fact of love and blessing that or praying for that which I think is the culprit. Many times it could be God, by the way, you know, in self-pity and depression. To me, self-pity and depression is merely non-love of God. A resentment against what God has done for me in my life, you know. So this is how I maintain my emotional comfortableness in my relationship with God. Now, as a result of that, Al-Anon is the most important thing in my life, because this is the key. Just like I'm sure for Goldine, the most important thing in her life is the AA program. Because both of these programs, and working side by side, give us the ability to not have to be dependent upon the other or cling to the other, and we can go about freedom and yet have good times together. At a meeting one time, I was sharing about the beautiful weekend we had. She was home sewing, I was up backpacking in the mountains. You see, before we always had to be together with one of us miserable. I used to love to go camping, and she would go as long as she had a bottle. She got sober, got self-worth, she doesn't have to go camping anymore, you see. I used to always think I had to go shopping with her, and I don't even understand the concept of shopping. I can let her go by herself now. And both of us can be happy and content, you see. So we don't have that old relationship. Now, when she got sober, I still had that knot in my stomach and that anger for her and loathing her and all that. And I realized I was the one that was uncomfortable. So I said a simple little prayer. I said, God, teach me to love her as she is. See, my defect was not loving her. So I said, God, teach me to love her as she is, which is the 7th step. And she started to change. And she's a very, very beautiful person in my life now. As of last February, it had been 28 years since we had an argument. Can you imagine that in a program? I'm not trying to say we agree. We don't. We don't have to argue about it, you know. She's a very respected member of Alcoholics Anonymous, former delegate, nominee for trustee on several occasions, chairman of the intergroup, a very respected person who no longer needs me. But I don't need her to need me. And as a result of that, we can have a good relationship, you see. And this is what it's all about. I want to touch briefly upon something, what I call my refresher course, and that involved a son. Our son Steve was 5 years of age when sobriety came into the house. At age 11, he started going to Alateen. He had 6 years of Alateen. program was within the house. This does not in any manner keep alcoholism from occurring in a child. We still don't know what causes it. But at age 15 or 16, he started his drinking. And Steve was a pass-out drinker. Whenever he was drinking, I did a lot of night work, maybe going to meetings, and I'd come home, and he was a pass-out drinker, and he'd flop his arms out, his eyes would stay open, eyeballs go up the top, and he looked like he's dead. And I'd come in the house, and Goldie would say, "Look at your son." And I'd go in there, and I'd grit my teeth, and clench my fist, and start giving him this whole story that I used to tell Goldie. And then I'd say, "Bob, get to hold of your program. You hold your program." So I'd let it go. And this occurred time and time again, you know. And one time Steve was, one time I was taking a course in metaphysics at a class, and the idea that if I can put an idea up here in my mind, lock into it, it comes true. It's a creative thing. I don't want to go too much into that, but I have no other way of explaining it. But I had to prove that point to me. And at one time, Steve had not had anything to drink for about 6 weeks, and he was absolutely miserable. That's not an inventory. That's merely a simple observation, you know. He was absolutely miserable. I knew by then I did not have the right to pray for his sobriety. But I felt I had the right to pray for his peace of mind, which was his relationship with God. In my opinion, any time we're at peace with ourselves, we're in peace with the universe and God. But I had to prove in this class the idea that thoughts are creative. So I used Steve as a subject matter for his peace of mind. And I wrote this out in a paper, and I read it, and I read it, and I read it, and I read it, and it finally locked in there that he was at peace. Now, this is the idea that before the occurrence, you always believe it up here. I went home that night, and like I say, Steve had not had anything to drink for maybe 4 or 5, 6 weeks, and there he was, all bombed out. And I didn't understand it, because I knew within my mind that he was at peace. And the next morning, I woke up laughing. Because, yeah, he was at peace. You want to be careful what you pray for. You may get it, you know. And I laughed, and I said, "God, help me to understand." And I picked a book up off my dresser that I had not looked at for probably a year, opened at random, and generally it said, "Now that you messed everything up, why don't you let me do it?" I said, "Okay, God, he's yours." I had one more incident. I came home, Steve was bombed out, passed out, and I walked in there, not gritting my teeth, not clenching my fist. I sat down on the edge of the bed, and I took his hand, and I said, "Steve, how are you doing?" Because I had a great realization. I use the term realization in knowing that I know. Not thinking that I know, but knowing that I know. No more argument. Knowing that I know. The realization I had is that Steve suffered from a disease called alcoholism. And I was probably 13, 14, maybe 15 years in the program at that time, when I suddenly dawned on me, Steve suffers from a disease called alcoholism. See, Goldine taught me I was powerless over alcohol, but I had never looked at her as suffering from a disease called alcoholism. So it took my son to teach me that alcoholism is an illness. Those two things. Alcoholism is an illness, and I'm powerless over alcohol. You know, Steve is sick. That was the last time Steve's drinking bothered me. Now, some of his behavior bothered me, but not his drinking. You see, I was free, again, just like that incident with Goldine. One of the things that I was able to do is allow Goldine then to have the relationship with Steve regarding his behavior and his drinking. And I then, instead of trying to make any kind of a triangle out of it, backed her up 100%, whatever you want to do. And ultimately, Steve had wrecked several cars. He was in jail frequently, sentenced to AA, all of those things that an alcoholic does. And I was able then to back up Goldine in anything that she wanted to do, rather than having any conflict between the two of us regarding Steve. And ultimately, Goldine had to ask him to leave the house if he was going to drink. And so he left. He went down to Long Beach and got into a lot of trouble. Ultimately, he ran out of the state, traffic tickets all over the place, and warrants for his arrest, and et cetera, like a true alcoholic. And he disappeared. And we didn't know that he'd gone out of state at that time. He just disappeared. We didn't know where he was or whether he was dead or alive. And he was gone for about 2.5 years, not knowing whether he was dead or alive. We had to work our program, you better believe it. And one time I said, God, help me to know, is he dead or is he alive? I felt I had a right to know, is he dead or is he alive? About 2 weeks after I said that prayer, we get a letter from him. And he'd come back into California. Down at the bottom of the letter, he says, I'm alive and well. Wasn't that my prayer? Is he dead or alive? No, I'm alive and well. So he came back into our life, and he would come back to visit us at times. I don't think he had ever been drinking. He'd always respect the fact that we had a sober household there, you know. There was one time he came, and I used to always put my arm around him and say, Steve, I love you. And one time after that, he said, Dad, you may not know it, but I love you too. And that was the first time in my life I ever heard that boy say that, see. See, one of the things that Al-Anon tries to teach us is to love for free. If we get it back, it's a bonus, but no expectation of having it returned. Just to give, you know. It was about 6.5 years ago, I guess, or 7 years ago, 6 years ago, that we got a phone call from a doctor down in Harbor Hospital in Long Beach, saying your son's in intensive care. If you want to see him, you better come down. I said, doctor, is it AIDS? And he says, yeah, it's AIDS. And Goldie and I cried all the way down to Long Beach. And we walked in there, and Steve had tubes running in and out of him. He was a very haggard-looking person. He was my height. His weight was something like 110 pounds, and nothing but skin and bones, and he was dying from AIDS. One of the things that we communicated with and talked about was the fact that he was gay also, you know. We never talked much about that. We always suspected, you know, never brought it open. And I said, Steve, I don't understand it, but that doesn't keep me from loving you. And that plus other things seemed to give him a perk, and he got off his intensive care. But they started giving him a lot of medication, which ultimately had both kidneys fail. And he was going to die. And he knew he was going to die, and he was willing to die. But he didn't want to die in the hospital. So we invited him home to die. He only had 2 or 3 days to live. So we brought him home. He was on oxygen 100% of the time and intravenous feeding and things like that. And lo and behold, he started getting better. Doctor was amazed. The doctor, it must be the home cooking, you know. But I think that what it was the love that was extended. And he lived for 1.5 years, which gave us the opportunity to clean the record up. Ultimately, I used to take him, be able to drive around with him. I was his chauffeur, not because I had to, because I wanted to, you know. And we had conversations. I remember one time, Steve never, as far as I know, ever complained about the consequences of his acts. He was always willing to take the consequence. He never complained, say, I don't deserve this. He was always willing to take the consequences. But he used to be a very, very gentle boy, very, very gentle. He used to complain about what society was doing for other AIDS patients and other people. And I, at that point, thought, well, maybe I better tell him some Al-Anon tidbits. And I'd throw an Al-Anon tidbit out and he'd argue about it, you know. Then I realized, hey, he just wants to be uncomfortable. I mean, he just wants to. I don't have to try to change somebody who wants to be uncomfortable. So I learned to, and then I realized I was taking his inventory. So I said, God, teach me to love him as he is. And he stopped his complaining. Tremendous power in this thing. You know? But after a while, he got this eye infection, which is very, very common with AIDS, and he started losing his sight. We had driven up to Seattle for the International Convention 5 years ago, and afterwards Steve flew up there to meet us, and we had a nice leisurely drive back, a beautiful, beautiful time. But I think that Steve decided he no longer wanted to live because he was losing his sight. He was almost blind. And so he started deteriorating. Both Goldie and I were with him at the time he died. I was holding on to one hand, and Goldie had the other. And Goldie, I was not in the room when he said this, but Goldie said that about 15 minutes before he died, and he had not said anything for about 12 hours, He suddenly said, "What a place." Now, I don't know whether you understand what he said, but there was a vision. Now, some people say, "Oh, he was hallucinating." Well, think what you want. But he said, "What a place." And short time later, he was dead. And then Goldine and I cried. We had all the knowledge that anybody wanted to know about death and dying, the hereafter, and etc. It doesn't work at all because it was up here in our head. We had to go through the experience of the sorrow and the crying and the grief, and we cried. Later, we had a memorial service for Steve, and the woman who conducted it was a member of the program. And she was crying because she knew Steve before he died. And I went up to her and I put my arm around her and I said, "Hey, it's okay, it's okay." She said, "Bob, I'm supposed to do that to you, not you me." And then I realized the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi, that it is better to console than to be consoled. And it suddenly dawned on me, this program works, you see. So we had to go through that experience. To kind of close on something a little cheerier, a couple of years after Goldine's sobriety, I was taking her inventory. I don't take her inventory anymore. I make loving observations. But I was taking her inventory, and I realized she had never made amends to me. And I thought, how could she be comfortable? How could she even be sober, having never made amends to me? Because in Al-Anon, we always put the alcoholic 1, 2, or 3, And then I thought, let her work her program, you work yours, Bob. So I let it go. And a couple more years went by. And I walked into the kitchen one time, and she was reading the AA Grapevine magazine. As I went by her, she looked up and said, "Bob, have I ever made amends to you?" And I thought, uh-oh, here it comes. I realized how important it was for her. I realized how long it was going to take. I said to myself, get comfortable, get comfortable, don't interrupt her because this is important for her. And I took a wide stance, folded my arm, backed up against the kitchen counter. I said, "No, you never have." She says, "Well, I'm sorry," and she went back reading her magazine. Now, those are the greatest verbal amends I've ever had from her. But for me, and I'm sure she believes this too, the amends are not saying I'm sorry. The amends for me are to change my behavior, to change my feelings, and change my thinking into that which is more acceptable. You see, the question on amends is, what right do I have to expect anybody to make an amend to me? If I'm waiting for somebody to make an amend to me, then obviously I've got a resentment. My job is to make the amends and not to expect the amends. But if you come back to the program as a whole, on the 12 steps, at the time of maybe taking that third step, hopefully I have, of making that decision to turn my life and will over the care of God, what did I have to offer at that point? Absolutely nothing. Until maybe some work is being done from the 4th through the 10th step to change me from what I used to be into something that might be usable in some manner through the 11th and the 12th step. And I think this is really what the whole program is out, to straighten up all the wreckage of the past and become usable. For me, I have always looked at what is my purpose in life. Why am I here? Why are we here? Just to be a father, a husband, or a businessman? Or what is the deeper purpose? And I found it within the last couple of years, so simply stated in the program, in the 12th step. We tried to carry this message, and we tried to practice these principles. I do not know of a greater spiritual act or purpose than those two things, which has been given to us through this program. So I appreciate being here. You're a beautiful group, and I love you much. Thank you.